Okay. Uh, Guys, I told you Seth Rao is joining us, and I love talking to this guy. He's always got some really great cutting edge stuff and challenges my way of thinking. And as I said, nobody knows more about drone security than Seth for me. So I really think they could be such a help right now. So no further ado, Seth, thank you for making time. What do you got for us today?
Thank you for inviting me, Larry. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you fine.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. And yeah, there were other people just as expert at this. I just happen to make it an obsession to know these things.
So what do you got? What do you want to share with us today?
Well, I think that, drones are a subcategory of the automated vehicles.
Yeah.
I think drones are kind of morphing into multi-domain vehicles where they can go underwater, on land, in the air. And the challenge now is from a security point of view, is to figure out this whole thing about remote ID, how to identify the drone. I think
Echo, stop. Sorry, my Alexa went off.
I think that's the biggest challenge that we have right now. How do you know that the person who's actually flying the drone, how do you know, the drone belongs to that person? It's a balance between privacy, risk, security, and protecting, right? I mean,
and now you and I had a little discussion about this before, and I remember when you had showed me the FAA had sent out an RFP, right, for some type of remote identification. The early proposals that I saw were not taking into account public key authentication. It just seems so weird. But then you showed me, was it Moskowitz, right?
Yes, Robert Moskowitz, Stu Card.
And now he seems to, so I saw he got involved and he seems to really get it.
Yeah, he does. The whole thing is, it's what's happening right now with everybody working remote, right? How do you know? You can do all the technology authentication, but how do you really know that the person at the keyboard? How do you truly know it's me at the keyboard, right?
And we don't. And that's a funny thing about, with PKI, it only shows that your private key was used, which typically lives on a system, not in your DNA,
Right. And with any kind of automated vehicle, the problem expands a little bit more. Because now you have
a remote driver.
Right. And you have a vehicle that may or may not be registered. But how far are you going to go to actually do a deep dive and figure out the vehicle and the person? And now you're getting into privacy issues, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the two things that are going to be the biggest impediment to solving this problem is bureaucracy and imagination.
Well, and it reminds me of what I was saying earlier. I don't know if you caught it, when they were talking about the Qualcomm XPrize, where it was to build a tricorder so we could do self-diagnosis. And they said for every cool feature, they found out that they were violating 10 HIPAA requirements. Yeah. And that slows down the release of these great technologies. But in a crisis like now, where like every day that you drag your feet, lives are lost. So maybe the good side of this is we could, put fast track some of this stuff, but I don't know that there is a workable solution developed right now. Has the FAA approved anything yet?
No, it's still, and I don't see it approving anything anytime soon because, with all the madness that's going around. I really think that the whole remote ID thing has expanded since the last time we spoke. Now we're using something. It's already on. It's on the IETF. Anybody can go look at it. It's using something similar to what Apple is doing, where you have the Finder feature, where you use multiple different phones to find something, right?
Oh, so they triangulate with other phones in the
yes,
area.
yeah, yeah. because the idea is to find the drone even when there's no connectivity. You know, there has to be some kind of mechanism in place until 5G gets here. Even that, well, you're still
It's
going
more
to have
land. It's a little more land based.
That's right. That's right. And the traditional aircraft use ADS-B. There's already been hacked on that. So that it's not you can't scale it. You're expecting, you know, millions of these things out there. There's no way you can use the existing infrastructure. It's just not there. So
No, it's like trying to run high-speed rail on our existing rail lines.
Yeah, exactly. But how do you solve this problem quickly? Because, you know, if you have places like Africa where they are delivering medical supplies to outlying villages and so on, they've been doing this for a while, and they have the data that you can analyze and what have you. However, within the U.S., it's a little bit, the context is a little different, right? You have the FAA, you have the rulemaking for the FAA, you have densely populated areas. How do you go from point A to point B in a safe, secure manner and actually deliver the goods? So these are, again, I really think you're talking about the XPrize. Diamandis came up with, he just started with a new XPrize on how to deal with the pandemic.
Right, right.
There's also something else called a global hack, I think that's what it's called. They're looking for volunteers to be imaginative, be creative, and solve these problems. So all of a sudden, this has become, I mean, you already had the acceleration of acceleration, right? As Diamandis puts it. Yeah. Now, this is kind of like a accelerant, right?
It sure is. And yeah. You know, you don't want to like discount any of the suffering, but to still look at the positives and say, you know, we're going to get better because of this. It's going to accelerate a lot of things. Like I said, I think UBI will be accelerated because it's not fair to make these grocery store people show up. I feel bad for them. You know, they're putting their lives at risk. My Amazon delivery guy is putting his life at risk.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that all of these, it used to be that, you know, you go to get funding, they would look at you and go, this is a harebrained idea. Well, now that whole thing is kind of changing, and everybody's getting into that going, you know what, let's just fund this and see where it goes. I mean, you have DOD that's looking at things. You had just about everybody's looking at it because, and there's a lot of organizations that are funding, from a funding perspective, they're looking at, let's help humanity, as opposed to, let me just invest a little bit of money and get out and make my money. So I think it's shifting, but not fast enough. And this is going to be the real accelerant for all of that.
I hope so, and I do believe that that's true. I believe it's going to accelerate AI. It's going to accelerate, like I said, AI is great for doing. Instead of right now, we test so many things on animals, and it's sad, you know. And the higher up on the animal class, the sadder it is. Like, you know, testing on a mouse is sad, but testing on a chimpanzee is sadder to most people's mind. And what works in a mouse doesn't necessarily work on a human anyway, even though we have similarities. But with AI, they can get better modeling. They're doing this, you know, genetic sampling of you. So not just so you get interesting to discuss your background at your party or at ancestry.com, but also to customize medication for you and use AI to look at that and customize these things. So I think this event is doing that for everybody. We may have vaccines that are customized to our DNA. You know, at the end of this, it might not be a one size fits all. You know?
Going back to the term accelerant, I mean, it's pushing the boundaries of the traditional way in how we're looking at things, right? Like, for instance, the FDA is saying, okay, we got to figure out, keep in mind, all of these organizations, you know, government run, what have you, they have very slow adopters of technology. I mean, they're incredibly slow.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So
there was a, during the impeachment, there was a funny scene where I was watching it with Trevor Noah on the Daily Show, and they show when they send it looked like something out of the British monarchy when they were the House is now announcing the impeachment to the thing, and the person they follow him walking through the hallway to get to he hands it off to this. I now announce the article, the first article, and Trevor Noah's looking at it. He goes, are we just going to pretend that nobody has email? Are we going to act like email doesn't exist? It's just so funny. And it's true. They sometimes operate, even the whole representative government, Timothy Leary once said, was set up 200 years ago when your information communication networks were horseback. And it took 2 weeks by HorseNet to get your message, a packet of data from Philadelphia to New York or whatever, but to Washington, D.C. And he said, even in the 60s, he said, we have phones. I don't need a person to represent me. I can just vote on the issue. And that's growing. Peter's pointing that out with like blockchain-based voting, where we're going to be able to not vote, every November or whatever. You vote whenever the issue is important, and you can vote on the issue yourself. And if you do say, well, I don't really know much about this particular subject matter, but my friend is a surgeon, so I'm going to delegate that medical decision to him. And so you can pick your delegate, and with the blockchain and private key stuff, we could do that. But and I keep thinking with the drones, though, that not so much in prevention, but they can help so much in both detection and response to this pandemic and any future pandemic. They can be flying around looking for things. There's sensors on these things, communicating, as you say, as a mesh network, that remote ID. If they can talk to each other, they can mesh each other up and really help collect all types of biological information. It's like, why are we having new, pandemic? Why is there a new thing? Is this a virus that already existed and we just discovered it, or did it just evolve, and why? And that's one of the big challenges. We don't know.
Well, there are a couple of companies that actually have these sensors. The technology is there. You were talking about Robert Moskowitz. It's called HIT. It actually has the ability to meet all the requirements in terms of privacy, security. Like, for instance, for law enforcement would need a different type of access to the information, right, to the data of the drone.
Sure.
Whereas you as an individual will need a different type than the law enforcement, because somebody's flying over your backyard and you want to call the cops and complain to them.
Right, just like when I'm driving down the street, I could see a guy's license plate. Right. I can't pull him over and say, "Let me see your license and insurance." The cop can. But
that's right. Yeah. So this actually meets all of that. And having said that, there's technology that needs, even on the medical side, to be useful. It's out there. It's just a matter of, how we're going to cut through the bureaucracy, how we're going to get through that, how we're going to be imaginative as to use these technologies. That's the challenge right now. We're sitting here talking about, we got all these ideas, but how do we, okay, so you got remote ID for drones. What else can we apply that to, right?
Anthony Valente, Anthony, you're typing that in privately to me. I think it's a great statement. He said the problem is we have elderly making the laws for the technology, and it is kind of funny. It reminds me, Anthony, your comment. I have a 15-year-old or 14-year-old who said that she goes to these awareness programs of how to deal with social media at school that are put together by adults that know nothing about social media, and she said it is so stupid. And I always, like I said, I'm going to use the analogy of fire this week, but I picture my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, using the fire and his father picking on him, and the mom trying to make rules. Well, why don't we say he's allowed to heat up some meals? You can use fire for 30 minutes a day. You can heat your water up, but I don't want any fires burning, after 8 o'clock. It's, Mom, will you stop?
Well, I mean, going back to the drones, there's incredible number of you were talking about the Amazon workers. Well, the infrastructure is already in place to do this, right? Unless you have certain cities that are incredibly crowded, like New York City or Chicago or Boston or Philadelphia. You can do this. And it's just a matter of getting it there. And that's, I really hope that it's going to get there fast, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and like you say, this could be an accelerator for it. The wireless vulnerabilities, you know, are always denial of service, if nothing else. Like you could, if you come up with the best encryption algorithm, you can protect the confidentiality of the data, but you can't always guarantee availability. You know? But I also think about that in the physical drone security. You not only have that issue, you have the availability of a landing space and a denial of service by a bunch of teenagers being wise guys that are standing in front of the loading dock or whatever, not allowing the drone to drop, you know, standing on the porch or having a party, or even if they're not paying attention, if mom's waiting for the pharmaceutical to be delivered. Yeah.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because there's, I think, 11 commercial spaceports around the United States, including one in Alaska. They have vertical landing and runway landing and takeoff, right? So they're already working on this kind of a problem and how you protect that. But with drones, it's a little bit different. I mean, everybody's back porch becomes a landing site, right, or a takeoff site. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with that? How do you?
Right. That's what I'm saying. If Amazon's going to do drone delivery, it better not be in the neighborhood I grew up, because those kids would mess with it. They'd throw rocks at it, you know.
Well, UPS came up with a really unique idea. So they kept the drone is actually built into their UPS truck, right? So it goes into the neighborhood. The delivery person is delivering to one house while the drone is delivering to another place. So I don't know if that's what will be an interim solution until we actually figure out how to really protect and do all this stuff. Yeah. And speaking of wireless, I mean, they're looking at short-range solution, maybe Bluetooth, to do something like this. But I think the real problem to solve is pretty much how do you deal with all of these different issues when there's no connectivity? You know, when there's absolutely no connectivity. Because
sure. And it reminds me of, I've had a lot of students in the Navy talk about submarines, you know, that that was like the worst.
There's actually a company up in Verona, New York, that's they figured out a way to actually solve the problem underwater. So all of this, you know, from different parts, some predictable and some very unpredictable, all of this is coming together. And it's, again, even that coming together of these different technologies, different ideas, and different, it's coming, it's
I'm also thinking, and NASA, you know, when they have a couple of challenges with their radio communication in NASA. Not only do they have huge gaps in availability, but the time synchronization. So if they discover an issue, you know, oh, we need to tell that probe to change direction. How far is the probe? You know, is it a light minute away? Is it 20 minutes away? Is it right? Is it Jupiter? It's going to take an hour. Yeah.
Well, we're still using some of the older technology. I mean, if those of you in your class who are ham radio operators will know that you can actually contact the space station using your ham radio. Is that a problem from a security issue? Yes, potentially, because you can send data packets over it, right? So that's an issue. But you're right. Communication is a big issue to solve. It's one of the security the communication and security aspect go together, right? I mean, you have to solve them simultaneously, as opposed to, oh yeah, we got communication going, let's add security. We did that kind of mentality, we'll add security later on. You can't afford to do that anymore.
My wife was watching new third season of I can't deal with the show. I glance up at it. What's it called? The Ozark, and a kid's flying a drone, And I don't know why. I think he's using it to spy for his dad. I don't know if anybody watches the Big Ozark, whatever it's called. But this other guy says, I thought they were just used by peeping toms, and that is one of the challenges. You know, there's a lot of challenge with drones and what you're allowed to look at, what you're allowed to view. You know.
Well, keep in mind that the drone, the size of the drones are getting bigger. I mean, it started out, you know, a couple of folks in a park flying these drones for fun. Some of them are the size of a large dinner table right now. They could fit in your office and not have much room to spare. So there was a a pilot at one of the conferences that I went to. I think he was with the pilots union or something. Before he started talking, the first thing he said as he was talking was, "I'm going to be out of a job, you know, as a commercial pilot, because all of this is going to be remotely done." And now you're talking about millions of these things flying around without any help.
It's going to be a huge disruption on the workforce for sure. But I hope, again, like an accelerant, you know, we're talking about this disaster and how it's, you know, for all its negatives, that there are lessons learned. And I think drones are going to displace a lot of workers, but as we do these packages to protect people who are not able to work because of the disaster, we should continue this. We really need to consider this UBI.
You know, why couldn't we deliver, you know, when you take out from a restaurant, can that be done with automated vehicle or a drone?
Yeah,
exactly. You could have a drone port on top of your building.
My wife is really sick of my cooking right now.
I can't help you there, Larry.
No, she's Chinese, and my stir fries just don't cut it. I worked in a Jewish deli for years. All my Chinese food comes out like a Jewish deli. I don't know how that works. Well, you're in New York. You know, you understand Jewish delis. In fact, you brought me one of the best pastrami sandwiches ever. Yeah, it'd be great if that stuff would deliver. I keep saying, like, for both detection and response, you know, and the response is not just dealing with the ill, but also the caregivers. Like, I think of these 900 New York NYPD people who were infected. How many of those could have been avoided if we had a technology do that first response?
Well, New York is a no-fly zone for drones.
For now, yeah.
Yeah, for now.
Yeah.
I think they have 4 drones, which something tells me it's going to increase considerably.
Yeah.
The police department. So essentially, in the overall scheme of things, we did not have a breach mitigation plan for the pandemic. That's really what it boils down to, right? I mean, we did not have certain things in place and one of them could have, should have, would have been the drones, because you could have done the policing that's happening right now. How do you find the homeless people who are wandering around with the COVID-19 virus, right?
Yeah, that's a great example. What a great example.
Yeah, they can go into buildings that somebody didn't lock the door, or they can go into buildings and they can infect people. How do you track them? You can't send your people to go track them because they're going to get sick. There aren't enough of them around, right?
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, these are the things, these are the questions that are going to be asked, and I'm hoping that it's going to change things and move them in the direction of, let's see what the processes that can automate that will better our lives, right?
Anthony has a comment about, he said he called the government line for drones, and he's in New York, he's in Brooklyn, and he said that the federal law allowed it and the city state cannot stop us. I don't think that that's right, Anthony. I think that local ordinances can override in fact, I ran into a similar thing in, my wife and I ran into these e-scooters, the electric scooters. I got her for her birthday last year, and we started riding. And PA allows them, Philadelphia does not.
Well, you have to get if you're flying under Part 107 rules, which is you have to be a licensed drone operator. So the law enforcement has, they're kind of stuck. Do we operate this as a government agency and get the okay from the FAA, or do we have our people go get Part 107 license and have them fly as individuals, right? But within New York City, yes, you're right. They did say no. I'm hoping it changes because I want to fly my drone around here. I don't want to have to drive someplace else and have to fly my drone in someplace where people don't want me to fly a drone.
Sure.
But do you, again, Part 107 is a commercial pilot's license. Do you fly under those and get a waiver from the FAA, or do you fly as a law enforcement and get a waiver? It's still up in the air.
So there are different requirements, and they're not clearly sorted out. Is that what you're saying?
No.
And that's an issue, guys. And we have these different competing standards and stuff that even like I was looking at and something we'll talk about more on day 4 because it's very testable about the an SSAE audit. It doesn't require a pen test, and it depends on who's interpreting that law. It's not clear.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, the local law says you can't fly.
Yeah, Timothy wrote in they can apply more strict controls, and that was my understanding as well. That the government could have one thing federally, but your local ordinance could say no.
Right, and
we don't allow dancing in this town. Right,
and also there are so many airports in and around New York City, which are complete no-fly zones. You can't fly in Class C airspace. That period. I mean, that's you can't even get it. As soon as you get 1 inch off the ground, you're breaking the law.
Anthony, I'm also thinking, you're not a Jersey guy, but you're allowed to sell alcohol in Jersey, but not in Ocean City. That would be a local law enforcing more strict. So, in addition to detecting the homeless, I was thinking, what other things could they detect? Notify the church elders. Okay, wise guy. I also would think of the vulnerabilities of drones. If they got hacked because of the power of the sensors, because the cameras, and other data that could be contained on there, or the damage they could do. I think of swarms. I don't just think of one drone. I picture a swarm of 10,000. 100.
Well, I think the Air Force recently they flew I think it was an F-18 without having a human in it. So obviously they would have to have extraordinary amount of protection and everything that we are talking about right now in those aircraft, right? Because it's from a military perspective, that's what they do. They need to have those in place. How much of that technology is going to trickle down to the civilian side, we're not sure. And the stuff that I'm kind of involved in on the remote ID side is it meets all those requirements. However, you still need to test it. It's a long road before there's an adoption of it. But there's quite a bit of things that besides having homeless people, looking for homeless people that you can do. San Diego took matters into its own hands, and they're starting to fly drones all over the place for surveillance, looking at the streets, making sure there's social distancing, that kind of stuff. They're already doing that. Whether they're going to get into trouble with the FAA, yet to be seen. We're not sure. But those are the use cases. I mean, law enforcement, looking for stuff that's happening ahead of time to make sure that it doesn't, preventative. I mean, in a pandemic, you could look at, where there's a crowd that's gathered, right? And you want to start looking at it.
There you go. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Watching for like people at beach goers or kids partying.
Yes. And you can try and isolate it, use whatever legal means are you have that you can use and try to prevent things from happening. So yeah, I mean, yes, there's plenty of use cases. It's just a matter of how, yeah, it's just a matter of how fast, we get there, right? I mean,
and the standards get approved, and it's not unlike the FDA clearing certain drugs and stuff like that.
No, it's not. This is all a matter of who's got the best technology. It's going to be fast.
Just like, and they get beat up a lot on the SDLC. So when we talk about requirements, remember we said the requirements are, if for us, we use the terms functionality and assurance. For the drugs, I say efficacy and safety. We have a similar thing with drones. Who's got the best technology to the efficacy or the functionality, and then assurance, the safety of these things. What happens if it gets hacked, or how does it fail? If it fails, like if it loses connectivity, will it, if there are kids standing on the porch and it can't land, will it land in someone's hair, or will it fly back to some safe site?
Right, and the issues, I mean, with the drones, it's like there are multiple points, right, vectors of attack. The drone, the communication, the console. Somebody might be using their cell phone to do some kind of, connected to this console or the drone itself. So you have multiple points of attack. Can we fast track and do this? Yes. The technology is there. It can be very easily adapted to do this. And the new technologies that are coming up in terms of the drones themselves, they can be adapted to other things that are out there that can be applied to. Again, I mean, it all depends on how fast we're going to get there. And I'm hoping that it accelerates. This really accelerates the whole process.
Yeah, agreed. So what else are you working on these days?
Oh, well, the drone stuff is one. The other is the energy industry, because everybody now gets to be an energy provider, right? I mean, you have solar panels on everybody's homes, and the excess energy that they come up with, they send it back to whoever the provider is.
I'm really, I keep saying it each year that I'm going to do solar, and each year I keep seeing the exponential projections of what the new panels, how efficient they're going to be. So, but I hear they now, after some real suffering of bleeding edge stuff, that Germany has got some pretty good solar sources, and they're in like what would be Canada. They're much higher north than, they get less sun than Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I'm interested. What are you seeing on the solar panels?
Well, not so much on the solar panels, but on the technology side of it, specifically security. There was a presidential mandate, I think it was 2018, that they came up with. The mandate was to come up with new cutting-edge, bleeding-edge technology to protect the grid. However, when you say grid, now you have people actually supplying the grid with energy from their homes, right? So what do you consider a grid? I mean, now all of those, and they're all connected to the internet. So how do you come up with security when you have, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of homes that are connected to the grid?
Security in terms of, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, let's say you have a house and you have solar panels, right? You have enough energy for your home. The excess energy you want to sell back to whoever the provider in your area is. And they're connected to you, right? Because they have to put the meter systems on and what have you. Yeah, but generally homes, people don't. How many people have a really robust firewall, let alone all kinds of security procedures?
Oh, so you're talking about them coming in to just monitor the power. Joseph, right. Joseph has a comment that is probably not exactly related here to what we're saying, but it's really important to me. So Joseph says, for energy, nuclear is a safe option, no longer a 70. This is not your father's nuclear energy. No, the nuclear power should make a total comeback, but it's just left a bad taste in everyone's mouth because they think of, whether from 3 Mile Island to the Fukushima meltdown. But today's nuclear technology is much, much safer. And that's true. I agree. But I also agree with solar. I think we're going to be mixing a few together. And I do want to get on that grid, and I can see a number of, you know, whether it's denial of service or as you said, perhaps privacy concerns of allowing the power company in, and what can I limit to them to see and only see. I see it's also a great, to me, application for blockchain type of technologies, you know, to ensure that I get paid for the energy I sell back, that's tracked properly.
Yeah, I think there are about 80 different entities, national labs, what have you, that are working on it. However, this is going to be a long road. I mean, even if you have nuclear energy, protecting the grid or even the nuclear installations doesn't go away. So you still have that in play where all of these entities are trying to come up with new ways of how to deal with protecting the network, how to deal with internally protecting the facilities. So that's still going to be there. I mean, it's not going away anytime soon. Even if we were to do like a 5-year plan on coming up with nuclear technologies and coming up with nuclear power plants, it's not going to go away. And yes, blockchain would play a very important part in this for several reasons, not just getting paid, but it can be something, the accounting and auditability of where something is coming from or where something is going to, who touched it, that kind of stuff when it comes to the actual data. So yeah, it does. But however, the first technology that has to go in is the security, right? Before you start adding on blockchain or whatever.
Somebody is with the name of laptop types in blockchain, a tech that's in search of its first valid business case. It's not exactly fair. I do know that there were so many coins though that I got lost. I was like, why do I need all these coins? Stop. You know, I understood Bitcoin. And I also understand, we're going to talk about why the use case that I thought it was going to be used for didn't work, but it still seems to be good for now for like speculation and stuff like that. Well, we'll talk more about that later on.
Well,
go ahead.
Listen, blockchain gets a bad rap because people have used it for ridiculous reasons, right?
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at somebody like Estonia, they looked at and said, look, this is blockchain. These are the use cases, and these are the only things that we're going to use them for. And they were doing that like 8 or 10 years ago. Right. And they got on the right path to do this the correct way.
Yeah, they have e-citizenship through that.
Yeah, cool. That's right. Cool. Yeah. That's right. The identity, which is appropriate. I mean, that's a good place to use that.
Absolutely. Yeah. But we'll talk more about that laptop, whatever your real name is there. And I suppose they're talking more about that. I guess Timothy's saying the main problem with nuclear is waste management, but it can be reused. Yet again, today's nuclear energy is a little outside the scope of this class, but it is different, and there isn't much waste. It is much more efficient, I understand.
There are companies that are doing the salt reactor thing. They're working on it right now. How to make it efficient and safe and all that stuff. So it's in the works. It's not like, again, I mean, it comes down to adoption, right? We got to pass the bureaucracy hurdle. We got there's a whole different number of things that go into adoption. So I think that's where we are at this point.
I'll tell you one thing, the Department of Energy, which manages all of our nuclear stuff, developed for me that was very appropriate, was the best pen testers I've ever worked with. So if you've ever worked with a pen tester that does stuff for the DOE, they get to do some really cool stuff.
They're good at it.
Yeah. Tom and I actually taught a class for the NNSA once, a CEH class, and a highly secure environment. We had people would have to escort us to the restroom. Strange environment there, but cool, very cool. So energy, drones, anything else you want to share with the guys that you think might be?
I'm also looking at how we can do remote ID for other things. Remote ID that's coming out of the drone industry. How we can apply to certain other things for people, right? Because if you can actually prove that, yes, you're the one sitting at this keyboard, why not adapt that technology to other things?
Right, and there are like attribute-based access controls. We'll discuss in day 4 about like some where you are, and sometimes people like realizing like you have to have whether it's your phone or some other token at the keyboard. So if I get up and it sees that I've wandered away from my keyboard, my access privileges are removed because you're not at the keyboard. Or some people even want to do it because you're in this building, but when you step outside the building. So there are attribute-based access controls looking for that stuff, and it does require some type of, as you say, some remote ID.
Well, I'm going to open up a can of worms. I was actually thinking about something like this for voting. I don't know how well that's going to work. I mean, the platform is good, right? But I don't know how well, again, it's going to fit into, because the companies.
We have blockchain-based voting. In fact, West Virginia actually implemented it. Yeah.
Right. I'm talking more of the ID portion of it.
Right.
Because, I mean, if you were to give another ID other than, I mean, do we really need to protect the privacy? Do we really need to lock that down?
Well, and Anthony's typed in a real ID. And did anybody know how the real ID, any underlying, something I really should have stayed up with. I assume it's PKI and RFID based. And so there's got to be some private key on a smart card. It's not really a DNA based, but that's really probably where we're going, Timothy. You know what I think about DNA based is kind of like it's a hardware address, kind of like your MAC address. And when IPv6 was first proposed, the idea was your node, your host address would be based on your MAC address. And that turned out to be a vulnerability for people to do remote reconnaissance and stuff. So they stopped doing that. And I think the same way, so they'll do something with your MAC address, hash it or whatever, salt it, some seed. And that's probably what they'll do. I think a DNA salt, you know, but not the only. Don't do it basically where you could reverse engineer it and figure out my DNA. But at least use my DNA as a salt so nobody else could provide my actual ID.
Well, I mean, yeah, you could. I mean, I was thinking about how I can actually, you know, use cases for other things. You're talking about MAC addresses. Even though you lock down your browsers, Firefox, this, that, the other, they still look at your hardware.
Yeah.
You know, on the back end, they still do that.
Oh, I remember back in trying to think, one of the first, what was it, Windows Management WMI interface? There was controversy about that because you could report back your MAC address. And then a buddy of mine, actually a former student of mine, a brilliant guy, Lance Cottrell, developed an anonymizer. And somebody figured out with when JavaScript was new, that they were able to write a JavaScript app that queried the machine's MAC address. Even though they're doing an SSH or an SSL tunnel to them, you know, it still wasn't fully anonymized.
Well, I'm trying to test Brave right now, which is a new browser that everybody's talking about right now. They are saying that it doesn't do MAC addresses or doesn't, you know, plow into your hardware. I'm not sure.
I think Timothy is also talking about Brave. What is Brave?
Brave is a new browser that came out recently.
Oh, okay.
If you go online and Brave browser, it looks like the logo is like a lion.
I have Chromium. I have Chromium in a couple of Linux distros. That's the default, I think, in Ubuntu or something, and also I think in Red Hat or CentOS. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing, right? I mean, how do you come up with a remote ID that doesn't plug through your hardware?
Right. Well, you know, it's funny. With the genetic stuff, and Anthony said, I think it's a bad idea. You know, we're going to close up here if anyone has questions, but I'll tell you one of the cool techs. So we talk about these DNA sequencers, and, you know, up until a couple of years ago, they were about the size of my printer, you know, but now they're coming up with them like the size of your phone and smaller. And they're talking about that these things will be able to, and they showed an example of a guy sitting at a cafe, and the barista brings him his coffee. He scans the cup of coffee, and he has the barista's genetic sequence on his thing. So, you know, people consider, like, I don't know if I want whatever 23andMe knowing my DNA, but anybody might know your DNA just walking down the street. You might not have any. So that's why people say privacy is dead. I do believe that we can protect privacy, but it's different. It's going to be more like PKI. This is why I like Robert Moskowitz in the remote ID, because he gets it.
Yeah, he does. And you were talking about anybody can know your DNA. You know, if you're walking down the street and somebody figures out your DNA, you know, why can't we use that technology to figure out if they are positive or negative for the COVID-19?
Exactly.
You know,
and I think that we could do that. We could have drones and other, you know, when we talk about autonomous vehicles, and they're not only going to be driving you to work and stuff like that and freeing you up to, they're also going to be collecting data. They're going to be driving down the street. They're going to be collecting all kinds of information. They're going to be watching things like traffic and reporting it back to Google Maps, but they'll be, you know, looking at the weather conditions. They're going to be collecting all kinds of stuff, and they could be doing that. They could be collecting genetic data, looking for problems. And of course, that opens up a big, you know, a confidentiality and GDPR. It's my data. I should own it somehow if it's my data, you know.
Well, that's one of the reasons we're also looking at LiDAR to figure out how it can incorporate into the drone ID as we have seen it, as we have developed it, right? So I'm not sure yet. It's still in the very, Robert just came up with the whole, how it's going to work. He's still
I'm getting a question. What is LiDAR?
Oh,
LiDAR?
Laser radar, using lasers to figure out mapping, that kind of stuff. Okay. I don't know. I forgot the exact, way too many acronyms. I forgot what the exact acronym stands for. You can actually Google it. It comes up.
When do we hit day 3, guys, and the early day 4 when we're doing network? You're going to be acronym to hell. That's the day where it's just like light detection and ranging. Light detection.
Yeah, right. That's what it is.
Very cool. Anybody else have any questions for Seth? I really appreciate you making the time here. This is a crazy week, crazy time in history. So it's a time for us to, on the one hand, suffer quite a bit, but also a time for us to stand up and to really show what we're made of, you know, and as you say, accelerate these great changes. Timothy Leary once made a statement that, and I think he borrowed it from Alan Harrington, wrote a book called the Selfish Gene, but he said a species will coast along at serene stupidity until faced with an evolutionary challenge. You will get smarter exponentially faster, or you will die. At which point it gets smarter and it makes adaptations, you know, as my Marines would say, you know, you improvise, you adapt, you overcome. And I think we'll figure it out. We're very adaptable.
I just want to say, I looked at some of your classes. This is probably the best that I've come across.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And well, for people like you that helped me out, I really very, very grateful, Seth, and also to Monica for all her help over the year and everything else. So guys, if there's no other questions, let's take another break.